Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very rich and a very varied coverage that the Commissioner has provided for us, providing us insight into the ongoing negotiation process, but also very importantly, the preparations for implementation. Of course, until the outstanding issues are negotiated, trade under the AFCFTA agreement, despite the fact that it has entered into force, is not possible. Just a reminder about those issues for phase one. When we take a look at trade in goods, the preferential tariff concessions and preferential rules of origin, which are the minimum requirements for a free trade area, are still under negotiation. For trade and services, our member states are very busy at the moment with making offers of sector commitments for the 5 priority services sectors. These are financial services, transport, communication, business services, and tourism. And of course, given our experience of COVID, we are starting to see a developing discourse which is focusing on perhaps expanding the number of services sectors to include, for example, healthcare services. What we do have to keep in mind, of course, is that the AFCFTA does provide for an expanding agenda. It provides that member states may negotiate and adopt additional legal instruments as may be required. So it is in fact a living document, a living instrument, which absolutely critically is able to adapt to a changing, emerging reality. So thank you very much again to the Commissioner for taking time to spend with us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our next session, session 2, which focuses on lessons from COVID. What needs to be done to facilitate Africa's trade? And since we have indicated that that session will start in 15 minutes time, we will fill in the little bit of a gap that we have. You're most welcome to get a cup of tea or coffee and come back to us. In the meanwhile, what I will do is to share with you some of the work that we've been doing at Tralac since COVID struck. As many of you would know, the Tralac 2020 annual conference was scheduled to take place on the 3rd and 4th of April in Addis Ababa. When COVID struck and the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on the 11th of March this year, we had to very hurriedly cancel bookings, cancel air tickets. Some of you may well have received your tickets to join us in Addis Ababa. Since then, the world has changed and the work program at Tralac has changed considerably too. It's not all been bad news. Particularly our training program, which had rapidly to go virtual, has expanded and grown beyond what we could have expected. Our internship program went virtual as from the beginning of April, and we've been inundated with applications. A very important feature of this internship program is the profile of the applicants. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started our internship program some years ago, the majority of applicants came from trade economists, trade policy analysts. That has changed, and we are getting an increasing number. In fact, the majority of applications now come from trade lawyers, recently qualified trade lawyers. The program is designed to provide an opportunity for recent graduates, master's or PhD graduates, to come and work with Tralac, to work with our staff on ongoing projects, but also to pursue their own research and other career development interests. This increase in the number of trade lawyers who are applying testifies to the fact that there has been a significant market response in the tertiary education sector across the continent, as many, many universities now offer postgraduate qualifications in international trade law and related disciplines. This is particularly important because when Tralac was established, trade law capacity was notable by its shortage, its scarcity. And this is changing. It means that we are addressing some of the capacity needs on the continent for effective rules-based trade governance. Tralac also offers a number of other training programs. We have what we call a Tralac certificate program, International Trade Law and Policy for Africa's Development. It's a very, very ambitious program, focusing across all the disciplines which are important to Africa's trade agenda, focusing on WTO law, global trade governance issues, but focusing substantively on Africa's own trade and integration agenda. In residence, we accept no more than 25 participants per intake. This is important to ensure a rich and in-depth and a varied peer learning experience. We were inundated with applications this year, and so accepted many, many more than the 25. And there were many, unfortunately, that we could not accommodate on the program. This was our first experience of virtual learning. We offer virtual classrooms to maintain at least some of the interactivity of a residential program. And this has been an extremely interesting program because we have reached corners of the continent which we may not have been able to reach with an in-residence program. And the graduates of this first virtual Tralac certificate program have recently joined the network of Tralac alumni, and some of them are with us today. We will be offering a 2021 intake as well, and applications have already started rolling in. But more recently, ladies and gentlemen, what we have done is to offer a short course, which we launched last year in July as a residential training program, reading and interpreting international trade agreements, a case study of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We advertised this, and within a week, we had many, many more applicants than we could cater for in one course. What has happened now is that we will offer this course, which stretches over 2 weeks, in total 14 learning hours together, supplemented by e-learning self-study. We will have 4 intakes of this course this year. On the African Continental Free Trade Area, the completion of the negotiations, preparations for implementation. And if there's one lesson we're taking from this course, is how important it is to study the legal instruments, to go to the legal sources, to study the particular scope, the structure, the architecture, the language of international trade agreements, to take a look at definitions that are included in those instruments, and to take a look at the specific provisions related to trade in goods, trade in services, remedies, dispute settlement, and much more, and how one reads a trade agreement, the many different parts that have to speak to one another to provide a coherent and hopefully internally consistent governance framework. It is very clear that this is a daunting task, and therefore the rules of interpretation, of treaty interpretation, are particularly important in such an exercise. And we hope that those 2 intakes who have so far completed the short course will be able to contribute to the discourse and capacity building in the various contexts in which they work on the AFCFTA. This has been a particularly important development for us. We have also had our first fully e-learning course, Data Science for Trade Policy Analysis. This harnesses some of the important tools of data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning in the analysis of trade data and trade policy issues. And I'd like to mention our top graduate from that program, And he is Mr. Wilfred Mbui from the Cameroon Shippers Council, who really has embraced the coding and the other important exercises that are necessary to master the techniques of data science and apply them to analyze our trade data. Important developments also as far as our research program has been concerned. COVID has pushed us into unknown territory. The pandemic brings its own logic, its own challenges and own issues, policy challenges that have to be negotiated. What we've seen across the continent and across the globe is, of course, that in the first instant, sovereign states have turned inward to adopt policy measures and introduce restrictions to curb the spread of the virus. That is entirely legitimate. In fact, such measures are provided for in international trade agreements in the exceptions clauses. But what we have learned, and this again, as we mentioned this morning, reminds us of how interdependent we are. National measures, particularly in the context of Africa's own trading arrangements, have important regional and broader continental impact. Border closures immediately cut off the livelihood of border communities, of informal cross-border traders, livelihoods of millions of households across our continent have been affected by those national legitimate decisions that were taken within the context of their national constitutions and national laws. And as one of the questions in the earlier session asked, regional coordination when it comes to responses to deal with a pandemic are absolutely critical. If we take a look at our regional economic communities and regional structures such as business councils, many of them have made enormous contributions to develop guidelines, to provide information on what kind of measures are being implemented and how we can coordinate to ensure minimum casualty, minimum negative effect from the virus and the measures that have been taken. But it has also focused our attention on the importance of national capacity in our ministries and trade-related agencies and organizations to manage the measures and the policy responses. Many have been tested to their limits to manage the processing of import applications, export permits, and so on. Tralac has, and we will share this with you a little bit later, introduced a COVID policy tracker, one that tracks both at national level, but also at regional level, the measures, the guidelines, and the very, very important responses that have been taken to manage and to curb the spread of this virus. So the impact of the virus has been devastating, not only in terms of health and related issues, but through the various trade-related measures, its impact has spread much, much further than we could have imagined in March this year. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a small window into the work at Tralac, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce to you some of our colleagues. Philomene Viljoen, Tokmo Chidede are here with us. We will have a dedicated session where the Tralac team will talk to you about some of the work we are doing on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement specifically. So thank you so much. We're now ready to start our session 2, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome a very distinguished panel to join me this afternoon, and they will share with you their experience, their expertise, but also make some recommendations, because I think it is the learning from this experience that we take forward to ensure that post-COVID recovery, reconstruction, and transformation of Africa's economies and societies is put on a sustainable development trajectory. I'm very pleased, therefore, to welcome you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to the session, Lessons from COVID, What Needs to be Done to Facilitate Africa's Trade. On our panel, we have Lily Sommer, and Lily is a trade policy expert at the African Trade Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Prior to that, Lily was a senior economist at the macroeconomic department of the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in Uganda. Lily's work focuses on a broad range of trade and integration issues. She works on industrialization, poverty reduction, and gender. She's published widely in the fields of development and trade economics, in particular on issues related to the African Continental Free Trade Area, informal cross-border trade, e-commerce, industrial policy, and sustainable development. Lily, it's great to have you with us. Welcome. I'd like to welcome Jason Blackman. Jason comes from a very well-known private sector company on the continent and globally, DHL. Jason is the Senior Director, Customs, Trade Compliance and Regulatory Affairs for DHL Express, Sub-Saharan Africa. He's a logistics and express industry veteran with over 22 years experience within the courier and logistics industry. He started working at DHL in South Africa in 1994 and has held various roles, including claims and risk management, export management. He's been head of customer operations for Sub-Saharan Africa and is currently Director Customs, Compliance and Regulatory Affairs for DHL Express in Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Jason. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Etiyel Chibira. Etiyel is the Senior Manager, Research and Project Management at the Cross-Border Road Transport Agency in South Africa. He has over 18 years combined experience providing cross-border road transport and regulatory expertise, research and advice in Southern Africa. He works on regional transport systems, design, transport planning, policy, traffic engineering and research, as well as professional project management. Mr. Chibira serves in a number of technical committees and working groups in the transport and trade facilitation sector in Southern Africa. He also publishes on these matters, and we certainly look forward to hear from him as well. Mena Hassan. Mena, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. Mena is a trade policy and trade facilitation expert at the World Trade Organization. She's been at the Secretariat for more than 15 years, and she's dedicated her experience to trade policy analysis, trade facilitation, and trade and development. She is currently a legal economic affairs officer in the accessions division of the WTO. Mena has contributed to the technical assistance pillar of the WTO by conducting close to 60 missions in developing countries, especially in Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, where she's delivered training seminars and courses on many WTO agreements. In the area of trade facilitation, she contributes to the program of technical assistance on the multilateral trade negotiations and the National Trade Facilitation Needs Assessment Program. She's assisted trade and customs officials in many capitals across Africa, the MENA region, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Pacific to deepen their understanding of the negotiations and of this agreement, which is so important, especially for developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our distinguished panel. Before I hand over to them to make their contributions on a range of different topics, I'd like to say a few words about trade facilitation and the African Continental Free Trade Area. A recent study by the World Bank, which looked at an impact assessment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, concluded that reducing red tape and improving customs and border management would add significant value to the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is not the first study to come to this conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. UNECA has done a similar study, and the Trade Law Center itself has done some work in this area a few years ago, just about when the negotiations were starting. So it was a time where we did not know exactly what the level of ambition for tariff liberalization, for example, would be. We did a simulation. And what we did was to take a look at what would happen if across the continent, all tariffs were completely eliminated. And we compared that with an improvement in transit. In other words, time on the road and time at border posts. And the conclusion we came to after many simulations was that indeed a 20% reduction in transit time on the road and time at border posts would offer greater benefits than complete elimination of all tariffs on the continent. These studies, and of course many others, point to the conclusion, and this was also highlighted by the Commissioner this afternoon, that trade facilitation, reducing time at border posts, facilitating procedures, reducing documentation, and very importantly, reducing time on roads, which still carries more than 80% of intra-Africa trade, will bring significant benefits. But ladies and gentlemen, it's also important to keep in mind that improvements in trade facilitation, customs and border management are really improvements in trade governance. They relate also to important areas of domestic law and governance, such as administrative law, which relates to the exercise of state power. That relates to what customs officers and immigration officials and police officers do at borders, the discretion that they have to exercise. Are they held accountable? Are they exercising within the limits of their mandates? These are very important issues from a trade governance perspective. Also very important to keep in mind that there's a close connection between trade facilitation and the trade facilitation agenda that we usually discuss in terms of improvements in customs and border management, for example, and the trade and services agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, transport services, communication, financial, and a host of other services are absolutely integral to facilitating trade across borders. And therefore, the trade and services agenda, which we are still negotiating under the AFCFTA, is extremely relevant to improve trade facilitation outcomes on the continent under the AFCFTA. But focusing on trade and services reminds us that regulatory issues are important. And this means that we have to take a look at the finer detail of domestic regulation related to key services sectors, those infrastructure network services which are integral to trade facilitation. And it may well be important that we look not only at cooperation in these areas of regulation, but we may well have to embrace the fact that we need also to look at harmonization of some of those regulations. My favorite example, as many of you would know, is axle load limits for transport. If we have differences in axle load limits between two contiguous countries, we have problems. And that means that we devolve to the lowest common denominator, circumscribing efficiency and compromising trade facilitation. A very important area of focus in trade facilitation also, and this is where Lily will contribute, is when we take a look at informal cross-border trade. Most informal cross-border trade, as we know, is by women. And during COVID, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, the devastating effects of border closures and other restrictive measures have seriously impacted cross-border trade by women, but also highlighted what we need to do to ensure the safety of women, to ensure livelihoods for their households and families. And this is an extremely important agenda. There is reference in the preamble of the African Continental Free Trade Area to trade and gender, but it lacks the detail of what we need to do. Lily will make some recommendations on what we can do to fill out this extremely important agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it's my great pleasure now to turn to our panelists. And we're going to start with Lily, who, as I have mentioned already, is going to focus on trade and gender issues and share with us some of the findings of a very important set of studies that are being undertaken by UNECA, focusing in particular, as I understand, Lily, in West Africa and certain border posts, and take a look at what we can learn from those informal cross-border traders to enhance trade facilitation across the continent. Each of our speakers, ladies and gentlemen, will speak for approximately 8 to 10 minutes. They each have a presentation which they will share with us. And so they will be able to show us their slides. Lily, you are enabled as a co-host to be able to do that. And then we'll move on to our other panelists. I would like just to remind all our participants that you may start posting questions and comments in the Q&A section and therefore contribute to the discussion. And we hope that we will have some time for good engagement with our panelists. Lily, thank you so much. It's over to you.
Thank you, Trudi. And first of all, I'd just like to say a big thanks for inviting ECA to participate in this highly esteemed panel, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So as Trudi mentioned, I've been asked to focus my intervention on the gendered dimensions of informal cross-border trade and the interactions with COVID-19. So I've prepared 4 slides to structure my remarks, and I'm sharing my screen now, so I hope everybody can now see these slides. So without further ado, I just want to start by sharing some findings from a recent pilot data collection exercise carried out by ECA and Hartzenbeg in the ECOWAS region. So informal cross-border trade, sometimes also referred to as small-scale cross-border trade, typically involves small entrepreneurs who may buy or sell across borders in informal markets, and traders who may not always pass through formal import and export channels for all or part of their goods. But this trade typically goes under-recorded. So our pilot data collection exercise aimed to record this under-recorded data. And this involved data collection on informal cross-border trade along the Abidjan-Lagos corridor for 4 months last year. And we covered 5 pilot border crossings along the corridor, covering Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. And the exercise collected quantitative gender disaggregated data on the type and volume of products traded informally to shed light on the important gendered dimensions of informal cross-border trade. An important finding was that female traders were found to carry out 61% of informal cross-border trade transactions over the data collection period. And this finding corroborates the existing body of research, which typically emphasizes the dominance of women in informal cross-border trade. But perhaps more importantly, we found that although women dominated trade in almost all commodity groups, they were much more likely to trade lower value agricultural products. For instance, there were approximately twice as many women than men trading in food items and agricultural raw materials, but only 1.2 times more women than men trading in manufactured goods. And you can see that here in this figure. And this is also the case for trade in fuels, ores and metals, where men are more dominant compared to women. And this finding indicates the possible physical and financial strains for women in informal cross-border trade, since we know that food items are typically heavier by weight and embody less value addition when compared to manufacturers. Now moving to my second slide, we also captured qualitative information on the challenges faced by female informal cross-border traders. And these challenges affect female traders' ability to take advantage of existing business opportunities and formalize their activities. So we found that female traders typically had lower levels of education or lacked access to information on cross-border trade procedures and cross-border facilitation networks. And this means that female informal cross-border traders can sometimes be taken advantage of and charge fees on goods or processes that shouldn't necessarily attract any levies. For example, we observe some traders from ECOWAS paying entry fees into countries within the region, despite the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol and the ECOWAS passport, as demonstrated in this picture of a quite frustrated female trader and her passport. The data collection process also found that female traders were much more likely to suffer from extortion, ethnic-based discrimination, and sexual harassment. A key recommendation of the survey findings report was to therefore establish gender desks dedicated to addressing gender-based discrimination. And these have worked very well in Kenya and Tanzania. Another best practice example from the East African community is the introduction of gender champions within the customs offices at some borders. And the champion is essentially a female customs officer that female traders can comfortably interact with if they have challenges at the border crossings. Then thirdly, access to finance. We know informal traders are typically unbanked and sometimes rely on expensive loans to finance their stocks. And this makes it difficult to scale production and move up the value chain. And a key recommendation of our analysis was to create financial products that target informal traders with a focus on mobile payments and lending solutions. Then finally, a general finding along the corridor was inadequate and poorly maintained infrastructure, which of course increases the time and monetary costs of informal cross-border trade. But we also found zero gender considerations in the design and range of infrastructure facilities along the corridor. So investing in gender-sensitive infrastructure, such as facilities where expectant traders can rest or leave their children in a safe place, can be very helpful in providing a more comfortable and supportive environment for female traders. Now I'll shift gear to the current context of COVID-19 and what this means for informal cross-border trade. So as Trudi mentioned, almost all African countries to differing degrees have introduced border closures amid the crisis. And currently, policy measures and regulations to facilitate safe cross-border trade amid COVID-19 have typically been confined to transporting goods using trucks. And this overlooks a large section of cross-border trade that is informal and involves traders moving across borders on foot. Yet we also know that informal cross-border traders are the heart of Africa's food systems and are acutely vulnerable to COVID-19, both in health terms, but also economically. So unlike formal trade, which can continue to operate through online payments, informal cross-border trade typically involves close person-to-person contact and cash-based transactions. And most border towns typically share one borehole or community tap, and most do not have access to basic sanitary conditions, let alone antibacterial sanitizing products. And these factors put informal cross-border traders at serious risk of being infected with and spreading COVID-19. As we mentioned before, most informal traders are unbanked and rely on expensive informal loans to purchase bulk stock. And many of these traders borrow early in the morning to acquire merchandise and pay back in the evening of the same day once they have sold their goods. So losses from unsold stock due to COVID-19, home directives and travel restrictions, which typically came as a shock to traders, can quickly escalate into heights in interest and in debt. Now, informal traders also have not benefited from traditional safety nets and targeted COVID-19 relief packages enjoyed by the formal sector due to their unregistered status, which also makes them particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of the pandemic. The pandemic has finally also exploited the structural inequalities that systematically disadvantage women and girls in the areas of informal cross-border trade. For example, there's some recent analysis coming out from the Eastern Africa Grain Council, which shows that the border closure between Rwanda and DRC is adversely impacting the economic well-being of informal female traders and their families. And this analysis finds that border closures are forcing women to use unofficial border crossing points, which subject them to exploitation, sexual abuses, but also health risks. And Rwandan women typically shoulder the main responsibility, of course, for caregiving in their households, so have had to bear more responsibilities of increased chores due to people within the household staying at home during the quarantine period. And the initial analysis also finds that women and children are more likely to suffer from malnutrition, exacerbated by the inability to afford a good meal due to the loss of income amid the pandemic. Now, my final slide focuses on how to design a customized response for informal traders amid the pandemic. So it's crucial that informal traders are reflected by African governments and regional economic communities' COVID-19 border management responses. So how can this be done? First, as Africa's markets reopen in cities and towns, it's now also the appropriate time for government to also take steps to reopen informal cross-border trade across official border crossings, which already have in place the necessary COVID-19 sanitary testing and quarantine facilities. And this will help to facilitate safe informal trade. Of course, any partial reopening of informal cross-border trade must also be executed in a manner that avoids overcrowding and congested borders. And one way perhaps to reduce density could be by alternating the days traders can cross the border, or by issuing a limited number of cross-border trade permits or day passes. Second is targeted supports. So according to sources at the Aflao border between Ghana and Togo, since COVID-19, there's been an increasing trend of small-scale cross-border traders joining forces, aggregating their goods and paying a bundle of fees to truck drivers for transportation and clearance. And learning from this, perhaps authorities less comfortable with the idea of partially reopening official border crossings to informal cross-border trade on foot, could instead consider facilitating the aggregation of small-scale traders' goods in collaboration with cross-border trade associations. And this would essentially enable informal traders to operate and earn an income in an environment that only permits the movement of cargo trucks across borders. Providing informal traders with PPE is also key, and the COMESA region has performed very well in this area and has dispatched consignments of PPE to 8 borders under the COMESA small-scale cross-border trade initiatives. And finding ways to extend social protection and relief to informal traders is also crucial. And in recent years, East Africa has proved that transferring cash to those most in need is possible with the use of mobile money and SIM card identification systems. So these innovations should and can be scaled. Then thirdly, digital solutions can be deployed to combat the spread of COVID-19 along trade corridors. We know that many informal traders now have smartphones with built-in GPS, which can be used to trace positive cases of COVID-19. Mobile banking and payment systems, such as mobile wallets, can play a key role in facilitating a reduction in risky cash-based payments, at the same time as supporting informal traders to scale production through lending solutions. And in fact, amid COVID-19, the Kenyan government actually issued guidelines to discourage the use of cash transactions. And in response, outlets are increasingly adopting cashless policies. And mobile companies actually promoted this shift by reducing fees and eliminating fees for small amounts below 1,000 Kenyan shillings. So this offers some important findings. And then finally, simplified trade regimes can be fully implemented to reduce the cost of formal cross-border trade for small traders. And this will help to gradually incorporate informal traders into the official trading system and in turn strengthen their position in the face of future shocks to cross-border trade, including pandemics. And we know we already have simplified trade regimes in the EAC and the COMESA regions, and the CFTA is also calling for a continental simplified trade regime. So getting this right offers the opportunity to ensure more resilience for informal traders in the face of future pandemics. So thank you for listening, and I'll stop here and look forward to the further discussions. Over to you, Trudi.
Thank you so much, Lily. This kind of study, ladies and gentlemen, is so important for us to gather information from the traders. We learn so much, but we also get hints at the solutions to the problems. And if we listen carefully to some of the suggestions that are made by our traders who are facing these challenges on a daily basis, our policy will be enriched and governance can be improved, and we can make it a safer trade environment for women and all traders. Lily, thank you so much. If you would stop sharing your screen, then I can hand over now to Jason. I think.
Thanks, Trudi. I'm just going to try and...
Jason, are you able to share your screen with us to make your presentation?
Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and do that for you, Trudi.
Jason will be picking up on some issues that Lily has referred to as well, and he will also be talking about some digital trade solutions. Jason, over to you and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And Trudi, can you see my screen?
Yes, Jason, we can see.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present to your conference attendees. So, COVID-19 has presented a lot of opportunity that we've seen over the last 6 months, both in terms of lessons learned and the opportunity to leverage off these lessons learned, and how do we use these lessons for the development of Africa, and also utilizing the AFCFTA for Africa's development. And it's been a pretty interesting 6 months for us at DHL, because we obviously been operating throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've had a lot of experience in regards to what lessons we've been able to look at and learn from, and what policy direction and developments we think we should be seeing within the continent as we try to re-stimulate trade and leverage off the free trade objectives that the AFCFTA will present to us. So let me just try and change my slides, because I don't think it's moving to the next slide. So just give me 1 second to try and move across. There we go. Just our standard disclaimer, which I'm not going to go through. It'll be on the presentation, the copy that you'll get. So in terms of summation, just as a summary, so obviously I think it's a common understanding that COVID-19 has changed our lives in ways that we never imagined. I remember being in Cape Town, ironically, in January, not even having a foretaste of what was to come in terms of the global and regional trade environments in which COVID-19 have changed. It restricted our ability to travel. It's only now that we're seeing borders reopening, and especially the one most important for me is the South African borders that reopened at midnight last night. If anything, the pandemic has helped to re-emphasize the fundamental importance of global trade and highlighted the challenge and the fine balancing act of protecting the health of the population and their well-being, whilst avoiding disruptions to the trade environment and to maintain trade facilitation. It's been a very delicate balancing act because this was uncharted territory for most governments. Nobody had ever been through anything like this. The last time I think we went through something similar to this was in West Africa during the Ebola crisis. And so it's basically rewritten the rule books on trade facilitation in many regards. One of the most important things that we've seen clearly coming out through this year has been the need to create a consistent and transparent regulatory framework, supported and importantly supported by streamlined customs processes that balance the need for compliance with trade facilitation and the attraction of foreign direct investment to drive the economic growth across the region. And what we've also seen is we have also seen that the AFCFTA and the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, offer the perfect regulatory framework for the African continent to succeed in driving trade and also re-emerging from the impact of the COVID pandemic. So what are some of the key trade facilitation objectives that we've identified as DHL and many of the NGOs and governments in terms of what customers want across the Africa region? And there's four things for us that stand out. It's the transparency, simplification, harmonization, and standardization. Those are the four key objectives that we're seeing, particularly from our SMME customers and communities that we engage with. What is it that they want from trade facilitation? What is it that they see the biggest demand for? And those are the four objectives that we've seen demonstrated as being needing to be addressed. So what are some of the key observations that I can share with you that we've observed during COVID-19 and some of the key takeaways that are going to help to stimulate trade and help to develop the AFCFTA? It's quite a long abbreviation, and I apologize if I struggled to pronounce it in one word. So as Mr. Stephen Karingi, the Director of Regional Integration and Trade at the ECA said, a rapid and ambitious implementation of the AFCFTA will go a long way in hastening the recovery from COVID-19 impacts, whilst inoculating Africa against future adverse effects of shocks such as this. We need to maintain momentum on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as a mechanism for building long-term continental resilience and fertility management. And I think that sums it up really, really well. It's one of my favorite quotations because it demonstrates the need for the free trade agreement to kick in from January 2021. We've already seen it delayed from the July 2020 implementation. So it's really important that we seize on the opportunity that COVID-19 has given us to stimulate the implementation of the trade agreement. Some of the things that we noticed during COVID-19 that we're certainly building our frameworks around and our engagement with regulatory authorities includes talking about the need for collaboration and engagement with the private sector before rolling out trade measures. I think the private sector can certainly not only during pandemics like this add valuable experience and insight, but also in terms of the development of the free trade agreements. The private sector can lend additional weight to the discussions and implementation challenges that are going to be experienced or have already been experienced in terms of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. We also found out during COVID-19, as many were aware, that a lot of the countries tended to take a pragmatic approach to regulatory enforcement and that they were err on the side of caution. And as we see now, as we've progressed into the pandemic and as the pandemic's rate of infections in some countries starts to drop, so those pragmatic and more stringent regulations have tended to now be reduced in the favor of trade facilitation and to regain our economic footing. We noted that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has the unique ability to bring all the 55 member states together, and it has the potential, as no doubt everybody's aware, to boost the trade in the region by 52.3%. And that we're looking forward to. It's going to help re-stimulate the economies, and it'll help reinvigorate the economic growth that we need in terms of the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of other observations that we've identified, we saw some reprieves with customs in terms of customs simplifications, easing of bonds. We saw in some countries simplified clearances, and there is definitely in most of the panel discussions I'm now having over the last 2 to 3 months, we're seeing a stronger emphasis on digitalization by a lot of countries and by a lot of the NGOs. How do we stimulate digitalization? How do we push forward the digital agenda in Africa? We saw many countries reacting to the pandemic by implementing restrictive measures at the border. And I know that my previous colleague on the call was talking about some of the border restrictions and the non-trade barriers. We also saw in many countries that countries restricted economic growth or economic activity to essential service providers only. Fortunately, DHL, being a logistics supply chain provider, was able to continue our services. But it was noted that in a lot of countries, for the first month at least, or 2 months, a lot of countries only allowed essential services to operate, which certainly restricted the economic growth in many countries. I remember when I looked at the map of services being offered by DHL in early April, we had a map that we did to tell our customers what services are available. And it was very much a case of a red map to start with. And then as the pandemic progressed and countries were able to streamline their regulatory processes, so the services started to open up, and the maps went from red in terms of absolute no trade, no border openings, to many countries going back into green, where they could strike that fine balance between trade facilitation and protecting their citizens and their health systems. What we did find interesting was that the physical inspection protocols that were in place before COVID-19 continued during COVID-19, and that was something we were hoping would be lessened in terms of the number of inspections to maintain social distancing, and to present a realistic opportunity for countries to look at the fact that you can reduce physical inspections on commodities and shipments and focus more on risk profiling and diverting your resources to the more high-risk commodities and shipments, rather than trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach. What we did see as well is a lot of regulatory changes, very, very continuous regulatory changes that seemed to change more or less in the last month or so. We've seen less changes in the regulations. I think as countries settle into what we call the new norm, so we've seen this daily change in regulatory legislation changing and reducing, and settling in now to a more constant regulatory environment in which we now operate. We noticed as well very little, often more so than not, no advance notice of change regulations. And basically, we would get a notification in the evening that the regulations were going to change the next morning. And in some cases, in some countries, you couldn't get onto the regulatory agency's website to get permits to operate. There was also a challenge with guidance notes and regulatory guidance notes to changes in the legislation to provide the guidance to the police or the enforcement officials on the ground in terms of how do they interpret the regulations, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And that certainly, again, as we progress through COVID-19, this certainly improved substantially from April, May, going into June, July, and August. We saw improvements, we saw better communication, and we saw more of a willingness on the regulatory agencies side to engage with the private sector and to ask for engagement and collaboration. And that's certainly something we will encourage, and we look forward to continuing that collaboration as we continue coming out of COVID-19, going into 2021, and especially in terms of supporting the African Union and the Free Trade Agreement area implementation in 2021. There was also, for us, some lack of clarity on the standards, and you'll remember in one of my original slides, it talked about the 4 key objectives that we're seeing from our SMMEs across the region, and one of them was being simplification, harmonization, transparency, the ability to understand the regulations and to understand what is expected and what is required, so that there is an ease of understanding and the ability to trade cross-border by being aware of what the regulatory requirements are and what the standards are, especially in the case of COVID-19 with regards to PPEs, face masks, for example, which became quite a staple product for a lot of SMMEs as they responded to their government's demands for more PPE and face masks, for example. So what do we need to now do is take these lessons that we've learned, integrate them, and make the necessitated adjustments to operating models within the customs environments to ensure long-term sustainable, modernized customs processes in collaboration with a free trade agreement and free trade area. Certainly going to be important. I think it provides us with a very good platform of what has worked and what has not worked. We need to look, for example, at the use of priority lanes for freight transportation at borders. One of the things we saw seen in the Southern African region is having one lane for both passenger traffic and cargo traffic often leads to congestion. And so, for example, priority lanes can help to alleviate that. Expediting of critical goods. Tariff relief, we saw worked in the early parts of the pandemic. Tariff relief certainly contributed to trade facilitation and ensuring that there was the free flow of trades in goods and food items, for example. And then most importantly, I think one of the big takeaways for us is risk management systems and pre-arrival, pre-departure processing, encouraging and adopting risk management systems and pre-arrival procedures with a view to expediting, for example, the release of low-risk shipments upon arrival, and to minimize, for example, personal contact. So I think COVID-19 has given a lot of countries the opportunity to see what works in practice in terms of risk management, and how do you reduce the burden on your existing resources, from example, customs officers, to direct them to the more important tasks of risk management and focusing on the more high risk, high value, or restricted and prohibited commodities traffic that comes in and out of the region. Some of the other observations, and I've got a couple more slides to go. Minimizing physical inspections, finding out how do we minimize the number of inspections versus risk management and risk profiling. Focus on critical formalities and the high risk shipments, as I've talked about. Important for us is the prioritization of AEO cargo, and especially the promotion of mutual recognition agreements in regards to AEOs. Certainly, it's going to be very beneficial within the Africa region for the various agencies in different countries to recognize each other's authorized economic operator programs or their equivalents, and allow the benefits from each country's trade programs to benefit those traders that are registered and those transporters that are registered as AEOs, to again focus on the more high risk shipments and to ensure the optimized use of critical resources. We talked about digitalization in my early part of the presentation. I talked about the importance of digitalization. So we're encouraging paperless filings. We're encouraging integrated system solutions, so single window capabilities. Especially in some countries, we've seen there are multiple regulatory agencies involved in the clearance process, but there's no harmonization. In the one case that I was looking at, we had the regulatory agency responsible for health management who had to issue clearances for PPEs, working in isolation from the customs authorities. And so you would get a release from the customs authority, but then you would get a stop from the health authorities, and the shipment would have to go through another clearance process. So I think this COVID-19 pandemic has certainly demonstrated the importance of single window capabilities and to increase the need for digitalization. We want to consider, and part of the trade facilitation discussions is considering single duty rates for low value shipments, review currently from the pandemic what restrictions are in place in Africa and how we can minimize those. We need to make sure that the public sector ensures as a priority that current and future regulatory decisions, as I've discussed already, are not made in isolation or in a silo approach. And there needs to be a broad, holistic approach that incorporates the views of all stakeholders in a controlled and focused manner. And then fast tracking and achieving, as noted, the paperless customs agenda in Africa. In terms of my last slide, some of the takeaways that we've got in terms of paperless trade agenda and how do you fast track it, because this is becoming more and more important as we're seeing in a lot of the requests from the regulatory agencies in terms of how do we move this agenda forward? How do we move to the next phase from the theoretical concepts of a paperless trade agenda to realities on the ground? So increase the reliance on advanced electronic data transmission. We've already seen in Europe going into 2021, the ICS2 project, where the European authorities, for example, are going to require, prior to loading of cargo, the provision of electronic data in regards to their cargo contents, the commodity, the AHS codes, and relying on the lessons learned there, for example, will allow us to also rely on that type of data transmission and provision within Africa rather than waiting for the physical shipments to arrive. You can do a lot of work on the pre-clearance of shipments based on use of data and electronic data transmissions in advance. And within DHL, as an example, the day that we pick up a shipment, so if I pick up a shipment today at 2 o'clock in London, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the destination import gateway facilities already got a copy of the digitalized paperwork and a copy of the electronic data related to that shipment, enabling us to start framing the customs entry and to start the submission process of advanced collection of duties and taxes, advanced regulatory approvals, and being able to facilitate that when that shipment arrives to 1 or 2 days later, it's ready to be cleared on arrival and go straight out to the customer. It reduces the lead times, it reduces the cost of doing business, it reduces the potential, for example, for demurrage charges. We need to recognize and accept digitalization as an integral part of a modernized customer environment. Integrated system solutions we've talked about, including single window capabilities and reducing the need for manual based entry documents. In the one country I was in last year in November, in an average week, we were generating, because of the demands of a paper-based trading system, we were producing over 1 ton of clearance paperwork a week that we had to then archive physically because it was the regulatory environment in which we worked. Additional fast tracks that we could do for paperless trade agendas is relying more on electronic document submission and digital certificates, digitalizing certificates of origin and the Euro 1 documents, and relying on digitalized copies of export declarations at origin, as some countries are now using for value verification. Simplifying the document protocols, especially, and this was alluded to earlier in my previous colleagues' discussions, e-payments for fiscal charges and e-payments for e-commerce, and reducing the need for paper-based payment protocols. We talked about risk profiling versus the need to have a paper-based approach to customs processes. So by leveraging of digitalization, you can maximize the use of data that's available to pre-assess and pre-risk assess your shipments that are coming into a country before they arrive, to reduce the burden of having to take a one-size-fits-all approach. And then, of course, we've talked about the mutual recognition of AEO programs, which would work hand in hand with reducing the dependency on paperwork through the pre-approval of specific traders who have met the compliance requirements of an AEO program in one country, which would meet the standards of another country. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the lessons learned that we have identified in the Africa region during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we believe can be leveraged off going into 2021 and assisting and facilitating with the operational implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you, Trudi.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that. Your reference to the ton of paper, that is the record of your transactions for a week, reminds me of the point that our commissioner mentioned earlier on, and that is the need for change management. I think we really need to think differently about keeping a record and management of what is and can be virtual documentation for cross-border trade. Thank you so much for that. It's now my great pleasure to ask Etiyel Chibira, who comes from the Cross-Border Road Transport Agency in South Africa, to share with us his presentation. Etiyel, are you able to share your screen and make your presentation? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trudi. If you may please confirm if you're able to see the slide.
Yes, we are. Thanks very much, Etiyel. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. I'll keep my video blocked just to improve the network bandwidth. I had challenges in the earlier meeting that I had. Probably just to begin with, Trudi, thanks for the earlier introductions. But most importantly, from my organization, the Cross-Border Road Transport Agency, we are glad to be part of this session, contributing to the input, the contribution of other speakers. We feel it's opportune time we're having this kind of session, and we should have more of this, particularly given the challenges that we're experiencing owing to COVID-19, but also the opportunities that lies ahead as we move forward. To our delegates, I've been requested to talk about regulation of cross-border transport in the SADC region. SADC is Southern African Development Community. Some of the long-standing issues that affect the movement of cross-border transport, but also trade flow by road. I will also reflect on some of the challenges that we recently experienced owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the solutions that we are taking forward based on the lessons that we've learned during this period. I will also conclude by indicating a couple of options available, the recommendations that we are making to the SADC region, but also to fellow regional economic communities in Africa so that we try to decisively and collaboratively address many of these issues that are pertinent to facilitation of trade, but also critical to moving the continent forward. So to begin with, we have a number of instruments that we use to regulate cross-border transport movements. At the heart of that is the SADC protocol on transport, communications, and meteorology. We also have a number of bilateral agreements that respective member states have concluded to facilitate movement of both freight and passenger transport. There are also other instruments that overlap between a number of countries within the SADC region, but they've been designed and coined to be aligned to the provisions of the SADC protocol. Why these instruments? The essence of these instruments is to facilitate access to the cross-border transport markets, and that access being done within the framework of harmonized regulatory requirements, harmonized standards, as well as the systems that we've implemented as the respective member states. The whole objective is to ensure that at the end of the day, we are able to facilitate seamless movements of legitimate traders, transport operators, whose vehicles are carrying the goods that we want to trade, the goods that we are encouraging member states then to trade with each other. Most importantly, the issue of market integration from a transport perspective, where we want to increase the market reach of every legitimate transport operator to go as far as they can, so that they are able to optimize on the market, but also ensure that we have a transport capability able to meet the demand with respect to trade facilitation requirements. So as regulatory authorities, we have created a number of platforms where we meet, collaborate, engage with each other at corridor level, but also at regional level. Recently, we established the Cross-Border Road Transport Regulators Forum in that regard. So what are some of these long-standing issues that affect cross-border road transport? From past research that we conducted, we've seen that a lot of these challenges are common, not just in the SADC region, but also obtained in the other regional economic communities. What is really different is the extent to which these issues are really a challenge and bottleneck to the seamless movement of cross-border transport as well as legitimate trade. At the heart of the challenges is the issue of the fragmentation of the regulatory instruments, the transport legislations, the regulations which member states have implemented are not necessarily harmonized. So what's the consequence of that? We have a transport operator or vehicle being subjected to different compliance requirements as they transit, as they move from one country to the other, as they move between countries, which does not only increase the cost of compliance, the cost of doing business, the logistics elements, but it also increases the downtime optimization of the fleet, which has got huge consequences in terms of productivity. And once we have those kind of issues, they consequently also affect the pace at which those vehicles are able to move the goods they are carrying to their destinations. The issue of unharmonized standards, speaking about vehicle standards, the axle load limits, the regulatory standards, as well as issues related to weighbridge calibration. Disparities in terms of cross-border authorization systems, which are coupled by different requirements attached to the permits that are issued using those systems, which again compounds the issues of high compliance costs once these guys move from their country of registration to the next country. But also important, the number and frequency of the stoppages which these guys go through for checks and verification of their status as it relates to compliance as they move from one country to the next also affects their productivity. And once that is affected, the net impact is the goods that are carried are going to be delayed. The goods that we trade in terms of volumes between our countries also sink down. Issues related to lack of coordination, physical inspections, law enforcement, which are often done by different institutions operating in the same segment of the corridor, as well as border posts which are not coordinated, which again have got an impact in terms of delays, in terms of transit time, as well as productivity of the fleet as well. The issue of unharmonized customs systems, which limit data interchange or exchange between equivalent authorities on either side of the border, which again adds to duplication of processes and procedures operators and traders are obligated to go through, detrimental again to the seamless movement of cross-border vehicles as well as trade. Of late in the region, we've seen some few countries starting to implement restrictive measures aimed at protecting domestic markets for locally registered vehicles, which is not just retrogressive, but will negatively affect competition in the transport market, which is likely then to be at the detriment of the quality of services operators or the transport system is able to render for those that are trading, but also to passenger movement. So we believe these are retrogressive measures which needs urgent and ardent actions in order to ensure that we don't move retrogressively. Very much so against the objectives of the FCFTA in terms of liberalization of markets. So what are some of the lessons through our experience of the COVID-19 pandemic? At the time of the lockdowns or border closures, different countries called them by different names. There was no plan on how cross-border transportation of goods was to be conducted during that period. It was almost like every country took their own independent decision without consulting their neighbors, the countries they share corridors with. And in that regard, there was serious impact in terms of movement of goods during this period. So what did we observe? As SADC fellow REX in Southern Africa, EAC and COMESA, we realized we have seen that we all implemented and harmonized regulations with a view to ensure that we stop the impact of, the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, but unintentionally, we also forgot to ensure that we create the avenues, we leave corridors operational so that we don't impact negatively the flow of cross-border transport, but also the flow of cross-border trade. So this unharmonized response ultimately culminated in a lot of disruptions in terms of cross-border operations, cross-border movements. And we had situations where some operators were actually not sure of the regulatory requirements applicable in the transit countries eventually when we started opening the border posts for freight, so much so that it was not easily predictable the specific requirements at any given time, as also countries were continuously reviewing their regulations with very minimal, if at all, consultations with counterparts sharing a corridor. So eventually, consequently, we had some vehicles getting stuck in other corridors and border posts. Drivers often and vehicles detained, number of days, extensive delays, trade flow as well as supply chains are equally impacted. So because of this experience that we had, a number of interventions currently, excuse me, were designed for implementation to address some of these challenges that we had experienced as a region. Credit also goes to the member states, but also the work and support of the SADC Secretariat in this regard. So what did we do? We developed guidelines on harmonization and facilitation of cross-border road transport operations, so that as individual countries, we implement our own interventions. We have a framework to conform to what we would have agreed at regional level, so that we ease the movements and facilitate trade. Similarly, with the guidelines for trade and transport facilitation, we designed, developed, and implemented standard operating procedures for vehicles arriving at a border post, so that as vehicles arrive and get processed at the border, it becomes easier for drivers to know exactly the routine steps they have to go through to comply with both the health and regulatory requirements. Driver testing were also introduced at border posts with mutual recognition of test certificates as well. We also in the process of implementing a pilot program on a corridor trip monitoring system, which will enable the monitoring by regulatory authorities of vehicles as they move along corridors. Where is the vehicle? Where is the driver gone? Where is the vehicle stopped? And what, as the vehicle reached its destination as pre-planned. So through this system, we'll then be able to track not just the vehicle, but also the movement of the driver as part of responding to COVID-19. At the same time, we'll also be able to pick up corridor choke points, the bottleneck spots, because we will have greater visibility of the vehicles in transit, which will enable us to respond effectively to some of those bottlenecks. There are also long-term interventions that we are working on. One which my organization is led in terms of designing is the Linking Africa Plan, which is a trade and transport plan aimed at ensuring that we transform the performance of the cross-border transport system, at the same time responding to interventions that affect trade and transport. So the plan articulates a number of specific interventions across all modes of transport, as well as in the trade sphere, which we need to embrace moving forward. In SADC, we also have a program called Tripartite Transport Transit Facilitation Program, which is coordinated by the SADC Secretariat, together with the COMESA EAC Secretariats as well. It comes with a specific instrument called the Multilateral Cross-Border Road Transport Agreement, aimed to achieve objectives of harmonization, and etc. We also have risk-based regulatory systems. My earlier colleague spoke about the need for such systems so that we're able to facilitate legitimate trade while it's balancing that with compliance requirements. Why delay the guys who are compliant? If we have the information, let them move as fast as they can so that they're able to make use of the equipment, but also enable us to facilitate trade. So in this respect, there is one tool that we've developed in consultation with our colleagues in the Southern African region called Operator Compliance Accreditation System. There are also other interventions. I've spoken about disparities in terms of cross-border authorization systems. And in that regard, we are implementing an integrated cross-border management system, as well as many other solutions, including corridor performance monitoring systems. So in conclusion of my presentation this afternoon, we want to increase trade. The AFCFTA gives us that platform for us to change the status quo as African countries. But the issue is, how far are we? Are we ready to change this? Yes, we can sign the agreement, but for as long as we have not addressed the fundamentals, the challenges facing the transport systems, the cross-border transport systems, we will still have a long way to go. So these challenges stands a great deal in terms of potentially derailing the achievement of the objectives of the AFCFTA. And it's our view that as we negotiate trade in services, we need not to leave transport behind. Rather, we should look at transport and trade as twin partners, as the two are very much inseparable. COVID-19 has given us the opportunity not just to reset and remodel, but also to re-engineer the heart of the transport systems, which are the lifeblood of trade. And how are we going to do that? We should focus on harmonizing all the instruments, the soft infrastructure, so that we create a conducive environment for now and beyond. And whatever interventions we look at, they should be underpinned by the need to ensure that we harmonize. We also improve coordination among and between regulatory authorities, not just those sharing border posts, but all those that share a particular corridor, so that we don't have a situation where we solve problems at one node, be it a border post, and those problems are transferred to a later point in the corridor, which will not do justice, which will not do any favor in terms of ensuring that we facilitate trade between our countries across the whole continent. Trudi, that's the end of my story. And thanks to our delegates for listening. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Etiyel, for that very interesting reminder of how interconnected we actually are and how important these transport connections and regulations are. We turn now to Mena Hassan. Mena will take us to the realm of multilateral trade governance and the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, reminding us that, of course, many of our African countries have undertaken commitments under this agreement in different categories, have yet to implement them. Mena, over to you. You're able to share your screen. There we go.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Trudi, for inviting the WTO to this very interesting panel discussion this afternoon. Obviously, trade facilitation today is being discussed heavily in Africa on the regional level, also on the continental level, but it is also being discussed on the multilateral level in the WTO. And this will be the focus of my intervention today. So my presentation will focus on giving you a brief introduction of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, as well as the benefits of this agreement to African countries. Then I will mention the status of implementation of the TFA for Africa, followed by the challenges for implementation of the agreement. And finally, some policy recommendations, especially post-COVID-19. So just briefly, the Trade Facilitation Agreement is the first and only multilateral agreement since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. So this, in the multilateral trading system, this is a huge achievement. It took about close to 10 years for members to negotiate. Over 160 countries sat down to negotiate this agreement. And it entered into force in 2017. So for us, it's quite recent, with a 2/3 membership who have ratified the agreement. Now, what makes it quite unique and special in the context of multilateral trade is that for the first time, and as opposed to other WTO agreements, the Trade Facilitation Agreement gave lots of flexibilities, what we can call special and differential treatment, but in a different sort of way that it used to in previous agreements, in the sense that it offered developing countries and least developing countries the possibility for each country to actually self-designate which measures it can actually implement upon entry into force of the agreement, which would fall under category A. And also then those measures which it believes, the country believes that it needs more time to implement, and those fall under category B measures. And finally, trade facilitation measures that would require more technical assistance and capacity building, and therefore more time, and which would fall under category C measures. Now, the agreement itself has 3 sections, but section 2 related to the special and differential treatment that I've mentioned, but section 1 relates to the trade facilitation measures. So we have 12 articles and 36 concrete measures to facilitate trade. Generally speaking, or broadly speaking, we can divide those into 3 broad areas of trade facilitation. The first relates to all the measures that are transparency related. This has come up from previous speakers, that transparency is really one of the main areas that for traders, they feel that is very important for them to be able to have access to updated trade-related laws and regulations is really key. For example, to have this information on the internet. Related to that is setting up inquiry points, so traders can access and inquire about specific information, say on how to import or export specific goods, as well as setting up appeal procedures so that if they would like to file appeals against customs administrative decisions, for example. The second broad area of measures after that is we can consider there the customs more related procedures to help expedite the release and clearance of goods, and also disciplines on fees, excessive fees and formalities. In the area of customs related procedures, we have, as we've heard, things like risk management, pre-arrival clearance, post-clearance audit, single window, as well as disciplines on formalities such as having e-payments in place, using copies of documents instead of asking all the time for originals. So all of these things that really are relevant to the discussion of trade facilitation, especially for Africa. Finally, is the third sort of broad area, and that is which relates to freedom of transit. Now, this is particularly important for Africa, where we have 16 landlocked countries. And here the measures kind of focus on not to discriminate against goods in transit. So to make it sort of, the flow of goods would be easy for goods in transit, especially for landlocked countries. Now, what are the benefits of the Trade Facilitation Agreement? And I'll also mention in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Trade facilitation regulates behind the border measures, so those which aim to lower transaction costs or trade costs, such as red tape or cumbersome customs procedures, etc. Now, there's been many studies that have been conducted and research on the benefits of implementing the Trade Facilitation Agreement. But one study from the WTO mentioned that full implementation of the TFA's 36 measures can generate $1 trillion US in additional global trade each year, and could potentially reduce trade costs by 14% for African countries, and it has a potential to increase African exports by 35%. TF reforms are crucial to Africa's export diversification efforts, integration into regional and global value chains, and also to promote investment. Now, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been many measures that have been implemented, as previous speakers have mentioned, such as prioritizing customs clearance for COVID-19 related goods, medical goods, etc., establishing special procedures to further expedite consignments of medical equipment or pharmaceutical goods to authorized operators, accepting the electronic submission of documents for pre-arrival processing, simplification of import and export forms, and also implementing green lanes under the guidelines for border management measures to protect health and ensure the availability of goods and essential services. Now, what is the status of implementation of the TFA in Africa? And I think this is quite relevant to the discussion that is currently taking place with the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, at the WTO, we have 44 African countries who are actually members. 40 out of the 44 African members have ratified the Trade Facilitation Agreement and have almost all notified to the WTO their implementation commitments. So they have notified to the WTO their different categories that I explained earlier. So overall, the implementation rate of African countries is around 37%. So 37% of the trade facilitation measures are currently being implemented, with over 60% of those measures that are not yet implemented. So we say about 23% require more time. So those would fall under category B measures. And 40% require technical assistance and capacity building, and therefore longer time for implementation. Now, while this reflects African countries' overall positive engagement and commitment in the ratification and implementation of this agreement, it's important to highlight that the measures which have not been implemented yet and require more time and TACB are the ones with the most benefits to African traders and for Africa's overall trade agenda. So I'll just highlight some of these now, which I thought were quite pertinent. Now, the first one relates to the transparency related measures. That we've been mentioning that for traders, transparency is really key. Having access to the information needed, etc. That is quite important, but it's not yet implemented. And also setting up inquiry points. So overall, trade transparency related measures and inquiry points, we have an average implementation rate between 15 to 18%. Of African countries as an average. Followed to that is the risk management. And here it's been highlighted heavily by our colleague from DHL that risk management is sort of a key measure that needs to be in place to be able to add to that or put in place other trade facilitative measures such as pre-arrival clearance, post-clearance audit systems, etc. So the fact that this measure is still not fully implemented by most African countries is something that one should look into. Following that is authorized operators, and authorized operators is also linked heavily to risk management. So we need to again have a proper risk management system in place to be able to set up a authorized operator, economic operator system, which would allow traders with good track record to get their goods cleared faster, maybe to benefit from less inspection, also defer duty payments. So this measure, we have an average of 18% of implementation. Following authorized operators is border agency coordination. Again, this is a key measure for trade facilitation. Because as you all know, trade transactions and the clearance of goods is not just the role of customs, but it involves many agencies at the border, whether it's standards, related health, agriculture, port services, etc. So there must be a strong level of coordination and cooperation between agencies at the border to be able to expedite the release and clearance of goods. And here the percentage, again, of implementation is around 16%. Finally, we come to the most ambitious and most costly trade facilitation measure to implement, and that is a single window. Now, to have a proper single window in place, you need to have border agency coordination as a prerequisite. And the single window would help traders to go to one place where they would be able to lodge all their documentation for clearance, etc. And the single window, there will be all the agencies that are relevant to help expedite the clearance and release of the goods. As you may know, single windows come in many forms. Some come electronic. Also, there are regional single windows, as in the case of ASEAN in Asia. Just based on these measures, what I'd like to also mention is that their dates for implementation range between 2030 to 2038. So this is what the African members at the WTO, they have put at sort of a frame or timeline for them to actually implement these measures. So we are talking in 10 years' time, or maybe in 20 years' time, we will be able to implement such measures. So, you know, it's important to mention that when we are discussing trade facilitation on the continent for something to happen next year, the year after, etc. Now, what are the challenges for TFA implementation? According to the World Bank and other international organizations, no country is starting from scratch. There's been a lot of donor support that has been already provided or is in the pipeline for TF reforms. And this is the case even before the trade facilitation agreement. So for many years, there have been a lot of donor support being given to African countries in the area of customs modernization, border modernization, etc. Now, while some measures do require a lot of financial and technical assistance and capacity building, many measures actually require more of soft types of assistance. So like awareness raising or updating legislation, procedures, etc. But there are also implementation challenges that are not resolved with technical assistance and capacity building. And this has been the work of many years of case studies and research on the ground that has been conducted. And as a result, some of the you know, let's say minor issues that have been highlighted are, for example, high competition between government agencies. And as you all know, the trade facilitation covers many different agencies. As I mentioned, it's not just customs, but you also have the Ministry of Trade, you have the Ministry of Finance, you have agriculture, you have the services, related ministries, etc. So tends to be some competition that takes place between the government agencies. A second point is the poor public-private partnership. I think this has been mentioned over the years, the importance of including the private sector in the debate, especially in the area of trade facilitation. And I think in this context, I wanted to mention the obligation for the WTO members to set up the National Trade Facilitation Committee, which would help coordinate trade facilitation reform measures on the national level between the different government agencies, but also by including the private sector as a key stakeholder. A third element is the lack of coordination between agencies on the national level and also the regional level. We've seen there's a lot of discussion going on now nationally, but also with the different recs, and all of that needs proper coordination and cooperation. And finally, and this has probably been mentioned by Ambassador Muchanga earlier, the lack of sustained political will and commitment to change. So this is really fundamental. So if we want to take the agenda forward on trade facilitation, there has to be this strong political commitment to change. And this will be very important in the next period. Now, finally, and I hope I won't be repeating from what I've mentioned earlier, but some policy recommendations, and this will be kind of my concluding slide, and especially for the post-COVID-19 pandemic, the recovery period. What needs to happen? So first of all, African ownership is paramount. So African countries must embrace the trade facilitation agreement as part of a pro-trade development agenda, with the aim of improving business and the trading environment and to attract investment. Implementation of the measures that I've mentioned needs to happen sooner rather than later. If Africa really wants to embark on trading on the continent as of January 2021. Implementation is crucial to Africa's recovery plan post-pandemic. And it's important to realize that when we talk about trade facilitation, it's really about implementing these measures really once. So if I have a proper risk management system in place, so I actually, it's a measure that I'm implementing, then I will be, I don't need to do it again on the regional level. I don't need to do it again on the continental level. It's done once. So, and this is where the synergies can be found in the area of trade facilitation. And then in this case, African traders would be able to benefit when they trade with their neighbors regionally, on the continent and internationally, once trade facilitation measures are implemented. Second, engaging with the business community, as I've mentioned, is crucial to this process. Third, it's important to go digital. It's about time for Africa, for Africa's future, to trade digitally, to go, we talk about digital trade, but also digital trade facilitation. And this is what has been mentioned as well in terms of e-payments, etc. in the future. And fourth, support from international partners and donors needs to be well coordinated and part of comprehensive implementation plans, whereby sequencing of implementation is taken into account. And this is very important in trade facilitation. So we need to have first a border agency coordination properly in place, and then set up a single window. Same thing with having a risk management, risk profiling system, and then after that I can bring in the pre-arrival clearance and the post-clearance audit, etc. And on this point, I'd like to mention that in the WTO there is a trade facilitation agreement facility which assists countries in the area of technical assistance. If they have specific needs, they can always contact the facility. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that in any reform process, there are winners and losers. And this is also the case in the area of trade facilitation reforms. So it's really important to put in place proper support and adjustments that will need to be made. So thank you very much. I'll stop here and I'd be very happy to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mena, for that very comprehensive overview of the multilateral trade agreement to which most African countries have signed up. The synergies with our own agenda are obvious, but your guidance and recommendations on implementation are really important as we start preparing to implement the AFCFTA and those annexes which pertain to trade facilitation matters. So thank you so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, as you see on time management, we're perhaps not doing as well, but I think it is really important we have a collection of very interesting questions coming through. I'm going to ask my colleague Talkmore to assist, and he has selected one question for each of our panelists. And I would like to ask them to respond to the question and also to make their closing remarks. If they can do that in 2.5 minutes each, that would be excellent, so we don't keep everyone here too long. But the questions we don't get to answer this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, we have them for the record, and I will share them with our panelists, and we hope that they will respond to some of them, and we'll share them with you in our conference report. Talkmore, could you start with the first question to Lily?
So the first question goes to Lily. It says, in Southern Africa, the International Organization for Migration will be supporting some analysis of the informal cross-border trade in the COVID-19 context. The UNECA research is very interesting. A 2011 SADC advocate strategy on informal cross-border trade also exists, which formulates policies that explicitly target ICBT in general and women in particular. Is there any strategy at the African Union level? Is there any strategy envisioned in light of COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a fantastic question. At this point in time, I'm not aware of a dedicated AU policy related to informal cross-border trade, particularly in the context of COVID-19. Perhaps one thing I'd like to emphasize here is that it's very difficult to formulate policies that respond to the needs of informal cross-border traders without data. So one of the key issues for overlooking informal cross-border trade and policy frameworks is the dearth of reliable and comparable data. But just like formal trade, there is a need for this data to be collected to inform appropriate policy responses and tailored measures. Without data on informal cross-border trade, it's very difficult to have an aggregate picture of intra-African trade, which is crucial as we prepare for implementation of the CFTA agreement. So actually at ECA, we are now partnering with the African Export-Import Bank for a second phase of the pilot methodology work that we were working on in ECOWAS. And the idea is to then bring in the AUC and look at how to develop a comprehensive single methodology and framework for informal cross-border trade at the continental level. So that's something we're looking at doing at the moment. Now, I guess my main parting message, Trudi asked me to deliver closing remarks at the same time, would be to emphasize that informal cross-border trade is a fundamental development issue. That does require greater policy attention. Several studies suggest that the value of informal cross-border trade between neighboring countries even exceeds the value of formal trade. Informal cross-border trade, as we spoke about, plays a vital role in supporting development objectives related to food security, women's economic empowerment, but also diversification, income generation, and poverty reduction. Yet we do see that informal cross-border trade is typically overlooked in policy frameworks. And I think the COVID-19 crisis and the border management responses with the focus on formal trade has really demonstrated this more than ever. And the pandemic has really shed light on the vulnerability of informal cross-border traders, but also offers the perfect opportunity to change this and do better in the future. Over to you, Trudi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily, for that. This is extremely important for us to keep in mind. A huge constituency of our traders is not catered for in policy. That should not be the case going forward. Lily, thank you very much for that reminder. Talk more. We have a question for Jason. Thank you.
So the question for Jason reads, some countries have implemented international trade single window to dematerialize and automatize import, export, transit processes. What are your inputs on that? This should be a way to improve trade and allow businesses to continue during the crisis. Over to you, Jason.
So certainly single windows in the countries that we've seen implemented have certainly streamlined the clearance process. It allows for harmonized and standardized approaches to clearances. We don't have a disjointed approach where you get the clearance from one regulatory agency and the shipment is ready to be moved out, and then the next regulatory agency jumps in and says, we now need to process an additional clearance. So I think certainly those countries that have implemented a single window have certainly benefited and have reaped those benefits, and you've seen those improvements where those systems have been set up. Certainly that's the way that the future lies. It'll allow for a more optimized and more coordinated approach to border management that we need to see as is common in many of the other modernized customs environments. So yeah, so single window, certainly I think at least two of the speakers have alluded to the need for single window processing and an integrated approach to border management. So certainly it'll certainly help to collaborate, support the objectives of the free trade agreement, for example, and support the objectives of the trade facilitation agreement. And it's an underlying principle of those trade agreements to formulate a single window approach, because without the single window approach, you're not really going to have a modernized customs environment. And in those countries that haven't adopted that framework are the ones where I see a disjointed approach to customs management, and you can benefit the most from it.
Thank you so much, Jason. I want to emphasize change management again. I think management issues when it comes to trade-related institutions are often overlooked. We spend a lot of time on training technical experts, but at the end of the day, their effective implementation of measures requires smart management, organizational development issues, and change management very, very definitely. Jason, I know this is something you emphasize a lot. I want to reiterate that as well. Talk more, a question for Etiyel.
So the question for Etiyel is to do with the uncoordinated cross-border movements, which were considerably noticed concern to many. From your perspective, where exactly was the weakness caused this disharmony? Was it the fact that countries were understandably acting too quickly and instinctively to respond to the crisis, or did the REG secretariats not respond as quickly as they should have to make a clarion call for harmonized cross-border movement? Over to you, Etiyel.
Okay, thank you for the question. Let me start by indicating that this pandemic caught everyone unawares. No one anticipated or saw this coming. So as respective responsible governments across the region, some sort of response was essential and required. And such decisions had to be made at very short notice. But it also laid bare the weaknesses that exist in terms of the structures that we have, not just at regional or across the continent, but also in terms of the people that are responsible for facilitating trade in corridors, the CMIs, the structures that are essentially established to look at some of these issues. So no doubt, the response was very much disjointed, but governments had to come in and respond. So you find that as regional secretariats, they had to come in. They had to come in at some point in order to provide platforms for harmonization of whatever instruments individual member states were initiating or were implementing at any given point in time. So I believe it's all due to the fact that no one saw this one coming. Regional structures did what they had to do, but they had to play a catch-up game because member states had also already taken actions to reduce the risks associated with COVID. Lastly, maybe it's an opportune time then for us to look at the possibility of establishing multidisciplinary fast responding teams made up of a composite of technical expertise to look forward to responding to any potential future pandemic. It might be a pandemic in transport, but it also could be a pandemic in some other areas, so that as a continent, as REX, were able to decisively and quickly respond to such issues. In terms of my closing remarks, I believe, as everyone has said this afternoon, the FCFTA gives us the opportunity to improve on trade. But there are fundamentals that we need to address that have a potential to derail all the good objectives, all the efforts the ambassador spoke about in as far as moving towards increasing intra-Africa trade is concerned. And what are those? These are the systems on the ground, the systems that holds back the operations, that negatively affects the people who are supposed to move the goods that the FCFTA says we need to improve in terms of trade. So what is required? We almost want a 360-degree change in terms of our mindsets, the mindsets of the people on the ground, but most importantly, our coordination between member states, between various institutions and corridors, all the way to the REX, but also all the way to continental level. So much so that as we address some of these issues, we are also able to enhance our coordination as we move forward. The future looks bright, but we need to make our hands dirty in terms of addressing the challenges that have been led by COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Etiyel. Talk more question from Mena.
The question for Mena is a very short one. It says, who are the losers from trade facilitation? Over to you, Mena.
Yes, thank you, Talk More, and thank you, Professor Patrick Lowe, for asking me this question. The losers from trade facilitation, there will be some losers. So the first that comes to mind is customs brokers, because the agreement wants to limit the the mandatory use of customs brokers. So those will definitely be losing out. Tied to that will be those who benefit from financial favors, let's put it this way, in the context of trade facilitation, as well as government officials who will lose out from automation. So unless they manage to train themselves and be ready to put in place automated processes, these government officials will lose out. So I think those are kind of the main ones. Otherwise, if, I may kind of conclude. I think, I mean, from what I had mentioned in my presentation, trade facilitation alone will not solve all of Africa's economic woes, but it is certainly an important pillar for all of the economic development plans for the continent, and especially in the context of the African continental free trade area and the post-COVID-19 recovery efforts. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mena, and thank you very much to our panelists for extremely interesting discussion this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, my only regret is that we don't have more time for discussion. But as promised, we will circulate your questions that have not been addressed yet, and look out for the Tralac newsletter at the end of this week, where we will post your answers. It remains just for me to ask you, all our participants, to thank our panelists for sharing their experiences, their expertise, and their recommendations. Ladies and gentlemen, trade facilitation to some extent is a no-brainer. But if we really disaggregate what needs to be done, it fundamentally comes down to improving governance. Governance at the domestic level, interagency cooperation at the regional, continental, and global levels. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you all for spending a lot of today with us. And it's been an extremely interesting discussion, and we look forward to see you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. That will be the tralac session on the African Continental Free Trade Area. Our last session tomorrow afternoon focuses very much on what we expect from the AFCFTA, and we have some private sector perspectives, but also some trade negotiators. We hope you will be able to join us. Thank you so much. It's been an extremely interesting day, and thank you for contributing to the conversation. Till tomorrow, have a good evening. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks so much to the panel. Goodbye.